All right, so we'll start. Welcome. Today we'll be presenting Kate Bowden from Disability Rights Rhode Island. She has been an attorney with Disability Rights Rhode Island since 2004. At DRRI, Kate successfully represented clients on a variety of legal issues, including Americans with Disabilities Act litigation in federal court, eligibility assessments before the Division of Developmental Disabilities, contested civil commitment, housing discrimination, guardianship, proceedings, and administrative actions before the State Board of Elections regarding accessible voting equipment and voting rights. Kate is the lead attorney for DRRI voting rights grant, for which she spearheads systemic advocacy, outreach, and training activities to ensure full participation in the electoral process for people with disabilities. Kate is passionate about assisting people with disabilities to know and exercise their voting rights. Kate, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. Let's start with our slides. Excellent. So we're here to talk about voting rights for people with disabilities, what you need to know. Next slide. So this presentation is just general information, not legal advice. So I am a lawyer, but not your lawyer. So if you have specific questions to your situation or a disability related legal issue, feel free to call our office and we will assess whether it's something we can assist with. Next slide. So voting is a way to make decisions. It's how we choose who is in charge. And this is a really important time that we're coming to in the fall of September 2022. In September and November, there will be major elections where Rhode Island voters will be choosing leaders for the United States House of Representatives and Congress, Governor, Rhode Island Senate, Rhode Island House, local leaders, and more. Next slide. A little bit about Disability Rights Rhode Island before we get into the content. We are a part of a national network of agencies that are called Protection and Advocacy Agencies. We are created by Congress and we exist in every state and the territories and the District of Columbia. Next slide. We are a nonprofit and we are federally funded. Our mission is to assist Rhode Islanders with differing abilities in their efforts to be included in society and to exercise their civil and human rights. So we do this through providing legal advocacy and education. These are some of the issues that we're focused on. I head up the voting grant. We are also very concerned about solitary confinement for prisoners who have mental illness in the Department of Corrections. That is something that we're working on. And we are concerned about people who end up in hospitals and institutions longer than they should. Next slide.
1 second.
Thank you. Another issue that we are wanting to educate people about is called supported decision making. This is a new law, relatively new law in Rhode Island, and it allows people who need some help with their decisions to keep their rights instead of losing their rights through the guardianship process. And also, as today, we're working on educating people about their voting rights. Next slide. In terms of the services that we can offer to people, we can assist people to register to vote, to decide how they're going to vote, or whether they need accommodations in voting, supports in voting. And so we invite anyone to call our hotline. We're open all year round. And the number is here, 401 831-3150. We'll have that at the end of the PowerPoint as well. So we welcome questions anytime and all the time. Next slide. I'll just take a few minutes and talk about some of the general the laws that affect people with disabilities and their voting rights. The Americans with Disabilities Act, often referred to as the ADA, requires state and local governments to ensure that people with disabilities have a full and equal opportunity to vote. And that applies to all parts of the voting process. Next. An important protection in the Americans with Disabilities Act is that it prohibits a state from categorically disqualifying individuals with intellectual or mental health disabilities from registering to vote or from voting due to the disability. So that means that a person's right to register and vote cannot be denied due solely to their disability or their guardianship status. Next. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 provides people to have a right to assistance with voting, and the voting right may not be taken away because of inability to read or write or due to education level. The Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped law requires that polling places be accessible in federal elections, and in Rhode Island, we also have a similar state law. The National Voter Registration Act is a law that requires state-funded programs that primarily serve people with disabilities to provide them the opportunity to register to vote in federal elections. And the Help America Vote Act, this is a more recent law. This is a law that requires the state to have an accessible voting system that provides the same opportunity for access and participation, including privacy and independence, that other voters receive. And what that means is that in polling places or early voting places, if a person is blind or has difficulty using their hands, they may use an accessible voting system to vote without assistance. And we'll talk more about that next. Rhode Island has a law that requires civics education. It was recently updated or amended, and I just throw this in here for any professionals or educators who might be watching. We really urge that the way to meet the requirement for civic literacy begins with functional voter education. And we think everyone with disabilities and without needs to understand the language around voting, how to register, how to find out where to vote, what kind of ID is needed, etc. And hopefully this this presentation will help with that. So next slide. I started out talking about voting. What is it? It's a way for us to decide who is in charge. It's important to vote because the decisions that leaders make impact our lives, and they can improve the quality of our lives. Next slide. Many people that I encounter in my community work tell me that they only vote for the presidential election. And here I emphasize that local elections really do matter. And as an example, in the city of Johnston this spring, they had a special election to decide whether or not to build new schools. The number of people who live in Johnston, the population, is 29,500, about 30,000 people. The number of people who actually voted in the election was around 1,100. So let's say 1,000. That is 4%. So 4% of the people made the decision for all of the residents. And the decision to build a new school has impact. For some people, it will mean a better environment for working or learning, but there's also a financial impact depending on how they decide to fund the schools. Everyone in the town may feel a financial impact from paying for the schools. So there's an example of, how you can have an impact locally. And next slide. Can you go back? Okay, was that? I just want to shout out to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They have some great resources, and some of the terms that we define here in this presentation, we did that in consultation with their resources. So next slide. So I like to start from the beginning with voter registration. What do you need to know? What's the language? And then make our way to the election process and voting. Some registration terms that people need to know is to register is to sign up to vote, to get yourself on the mailing list. A citizen of the United States, that is someone who is born in the United States or legally obtained the status of a US citizen. A resident of Rhode Island, that is someone who lives in Rhode Island and has their main address here. Another term that is useful to know when a person is registering to vote is the term political party, or the phrase political party. This is a group of elected leaders that share ideas and work together. Next slide. Another phrase to know is party affiliation. So this is a term that one will encounter when they are filling out a voter registration form or registering online. Party affiliation is when a voter is attached or connected to a political party. You will also see the terms Democrat and Republican on a registration form. These are the names of two political parties in America. And unaffiliated is a term on the form. And what this means, this is the Rhode Island term for when someone is not officially attached or connected to a political party. Sometimes we hear about leaders who say that they are running as independent. The term we use in Rhode Island for a voter who's not connected to either party, any party, is unaffiliated. Next slide. When a person is registering to vote, they are asked to swear or affirm certain things on that form. And what that means is that you are promising that the information on the form is accurate and true. Also, a person is required to affirm that they are not incarcerated in a correctional facility upon a felony conviction. And what that means is that the person is not currently in jail for a serious crime. Next slide. The voter also has to affirm that they have not been lawfully judged mentally incompetent to vote by a court of law. And what that means is that no court has evaluated the person's mental ability to vote and then made an order taking away the person's right to vote. And we will talk a little bit more about what that means and when it would come up. Finally, on the voter registration form, there's the term the Board of Canvassers. These are the people in every city or town who provide voting services. So when you fill out a voter registration form, you are returning it to the Board of Canvassers. Next slide. Okay, so now we move into eligibility. Who can register to vote and who can vote? You got some clues from the language that we discussed around voter registration. A person must be a United States citizen, and they must be 18 years old to vote. However, in Rhode Island, a person may pre-register at age 16. A person must be a resident in the town where they want to vote, and they must be registered to vote before the deadline. There is an exception for presidential elections that allow people to vote for president and vice president only on the same day as the election. This coming fall is not a presidential election, so people need to meet the deadlines for registering to vote. Next slide. Who can vote? Let's look at the mental health law. Some people have questions around this. A person who is in need of care and treatment in a facility, such as Butler Hospital or the state hospital, can vote. 40.1-5-5 of the mental health law provides that patients retain the right to vote and to participate in political activity. That law also states that a person shall not be deemed incompetent to manage their affairs just based solely on the fact of being admitted or certified to a facility. So this is important to note that even if a person is in a hospital or a facility involuntarily, without their permission, that person can still vote. Next slide. I received many questions about criminal history and voting. A person who was convicted of a felony can vote if the person is no longer incarcerated, no longer in jail, and the person is registered to vote. A person can vote if they are incarcerated, so they're in jail, but they have not been convicted of a felony and they are registered. So this could come up if a person is in jail, incarcerated, and waiting for trial, so they can vote, or if they are incarcerated based on a conviction that is a misdemeanor, not as serious. Next slide. A person who was charged with a crime but was found not guilty by reason of insanity can vote. That person must register to vote. Next slide. We also received many questions about guardianship and voting. A person who has a legal guardian that was appointed by a probate court may think that they're not allowed to vote, but that is not the rule. A person who has a legal guardian can vote as long as the guardianship order does not prohibit the person from voting. So as long as the guardianship order does not take away the right to vote. Next slide. Under the Rhode Island guardianship law, guardianships are required to be limited unless the person is totally incapacitated. And anyone who has a limited guardian appointed to them retains their legal and civil rights, except those that have been specifically suspended by the order. So this is just to affirm that under the law, a person retains their right to vote, even if they have a guardian, so long as the order does not take away the right to vote. Next slide. The consensus among experts in this area is that a person under guardianship should retain the right to vote if the person can communicate, with or without a reasonable accommodation, a desire to participate in the voting process. So if a person wants to participate, they're interested, then they should be allowed to participate. And I have links to some interesting policy documents from the American Bar Association on that issue. Next slide. I want to emphasize supported decision-making here. Rhode Island has a law called the Rhode Island Supported Decision-Making Act. Study after study has shown that when people with disabilities have more control over their lives and make more decisions for themselves, when they have more self-determination, they have better lives. That is a quote from Jonathan Martinez. He is a supporter and educator about supported decision-making. And you can learn more about that on our website. And voting is really a part of this. When you vote, you are making decisions, and your life is better when you do it. Next slide. So a summary of voter registration eligibility. The person is allowed to register. They are eligible to register if they meet all of the voter registration requirements. And those are that they be a citizen, age 16 to register, 18 to vote, a Rhode Island resident, not in jail for a serious crime, and no court order taking away the right to vote, and then registered within the deadline. Next slide. Who cannot vote? A summary. A person who is currently incarcerated in the Department of Corrections on a felony conviction cannot vote. A person who had a court hearing about their ability to understand voting that resulted in a written court order finding that the person does not have mental ability to vote. And finally, a person who is not able to show a desire to vote or make voting choices. Next slide. We often receive questions about homelessness and voting. How do I vote if I'm experiencing housing insecurity? A person may register to vote from the shelter or other address where the person is usually located. And if the person does not have any such address, then the person can register with the local board of canvassers, the local voting people. I do encourage folks to contact the city or town and confirm that with them before registering from the local board of canvassers. Next slide. If a person does register without providing an address where they actually receive mail, if mail is returned back to the local board of canvassers, they will require that a person fill out a voter affirmation form when they do appear to vote. Next slide. All right, so there are several ways to sign up to vote, to register to vote. One way is to fill out a form and return it to the local board of canvassers. And I have provided a link so that people can find that form on the Secretary of State's website. And next slide. If a person has an ID that was issued by the Rhode Island Division of Motor Vehicles, state ID or a license, that person can register to vote online at the Secretary of State's website. Anyone can call Disability Rights Rhode Island if they need assistance to register, if they want help with the form, or any guidance on this. And I will, as a final point on this, explain that when you register to vote, you are registered, and you only need to re-register or update your registration when changes occur, such as a new address or a name. Next slide. Some tips for if you are using the form to fill out your voter registration. Make sure to print clearly. It's best to provide an ID number if you can. They have options for the last 4 digits of your social security number or your state license or ID. You will decide if you're going to choose a political party or unaffiliated, and then you return the form to the board of canvassers. I'm throwing out a few more terms here as we move into the next phase of voting. Most people will know these, but for new voters, they're good terms to know. A candidate is a person who wants a leadership job. We hear people talk about running for office. This is when a candidate explains their ideas and asks people to vote for them. Another term you hear at election time is the word debate. This is when a group of candidates talk about their ideas, and each one is trying to show that they have the best ideas as a way to get people to vote for them. Next slide. Here are a couple that are really important: the ballot and the provisional ballot. So the ballot is a list of candidates or plans that people can vote for. And it's usually a piece of paper that you encounter at the polls or early voting, or if you're voting by mail. A provisional ballot, oh, could you go back one sec? A provisional ballot is a ballot that is used to record a person's vote if there are questions about the voter's eligibility, whether they're allowed to vote, that need to be resolved before the vote can be counted. So with the provisional ballot, the voter marks the ballot and then it is held to the side in a secure location. It is not counted right at that moment until whatever issue or problem can be resolved. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in voting rights, which we're ready to move to the next slide. So rights, we're here talking about rights, which are things that we are entitled to that allow us different kinds of personal freedoms. In the United States, people have the right to freedom of speech and religion. Another example of rights is that many students with disabilities have the right to special education services at school. Next slide. There are a number of voting rights for people with disabilities, and I'm going to list them here, and then we'll get into them when we talk further about the voting process. So there is the right to assistance, the right to privacy and independence, the right to a provisional ballot, which we just defined, the right to an accessible polling place, the right to accommodations, and to file a complaint. Next slide. So how does a person vote if they have trouble reading, writing, or marking a ballot? The options are that a person can use the assistant of their choice, and all of these we'll discuss in detail and kind of figure out how they relate to the different voting rights. A person can use the assistant of their choice. A person can receive help from a pair of poll workers. A person can use the accessible mail ballot voting at home, which is a relatively new feature in Rhode Island. And a person could use the accessible voting systems that are at every polling place and early voting. Next slide. So talking about the right to your assistant of choice, an assistant of choice. If a voter needs help to vote because of disability or inability to read or write, then the voter may receive help from a bipartisan pair of poll workers or the person of their choice. The person that you choose to help may not be from your employer or your agent, a union agent, excuse me, from your labor union. And if you bring the assistant of your choice to the polls, you and your assistant will have to fill out a form, which basically is where you promise that you have not brought someone from your employer or your union. Next slide. With the right to assistance, the voter receives help with marking the ballot. The voter must be able to make their own choices and communicate how they want the ballot to be marked. So the assistant may not tell the voter who or what to vote for. And the link I have here is to a really great resource from the American Bar Association that talks about how to support people in voting in a way that doesn't influence the voter. Next slide. So assistive technology are machines that help people. I indicated that we have accessible voting systems, which was a requirement of the Help America Vote Act. Every polling place has a machine that can read and mark a ballot for a person. They are called accessible voting systems, and they support the right to privacy and independence. In Rhode Island, for many years, we've used the Automark voting system. If you don't need the machine, you might not have noticed that we have them. And it seems very probable that Rhode Island is moving towards using a different machine called the Express Vote. And with this technology, the voter places the ballot into the machine, and then there are headphones available, and the machine reads the ballot to the person, and the person can use the touch screen or buttons that have Braille in order to make selections. And then the machine marks the ballot for the person, and then the person brings their ballot and inserts it into the ballot counting machine that all the other voters use. Next slide. I defined for you a provisional ballot. That's a ballot that a person would mark if there's some question or problem related to their eligibility to vote. So if a voting official believes that a person is not eligible or allowed to vote, the voter has a right to vote a provisional ballot. Now, the reason why we think of this as a right is that before the Help America Vote Act, the election officials might have just sent the voter off without any opportunity to vote. Now you have a right to that provisional ballot. This can come up if the voter did not bring their proper photo ID to the polling place, if a person went to the wrong polling place, or thinks they're registered but they are not registered. And what happens when you're asked to vote a provisional ballot is that the voter fills out some forms, they mark the ballot, and the ballot is held to the side to resolve the problem. And the voter is provided with information on how to track that to find out if their ballot was counted. Next slide. Accessible polling places. This means that you can get in and out of your polling place. The law requires that polling places be situated in buildings that can be entered and exited by people who have disabilities. This access includes parking, a clear path of travel to an accessible door that a person with a wheelchair or walker can find and navigate. So if you arrive at a polling place and you really can't tell where you're supposed to vote, that is an access problem. And Disability Rights Rhode Island works on access at polling places, and we would love to hear from you if you encounter any kind of problems, especially calling us on election day so that we can try to get it resolved for other voters. Next slide. Another feature in Rhode Island for access is the accessible mail ballot voting option. This is most useful for people with print disabilities, people who have difficulty reading, writing, or marking a ballot. You have the option to request an accessible mail ballot. You have to submit an application, and then this will allow a voter to use their own technology at home to read and mark the ballot. The voter is then, under the current system, required to print the ballot at home and return it to the election officials in one of the official mail ballot envelopes that they will send to the voter when the voter applies to vote by mail. Next slide. Accommodations. So voters have rights to accommodations, which are things that provide support. Examples of those would be a large print ballot, a braille or tactile ballot. Also, if a person has trouble standing in line because of their disability, requesting a chair would be an accommodation. Next slide. And if a voter has a right to file a complaint if they have problems accessing their polling place or other difficulties. There is an administrative complaint process with the Board of Elections. The deadline is very short. It is 90 days. So if you encounter difficulty voting, please do contact Disability Rights Rhode Island, and we will assess whether we can assist you with that. Next slide. There are two kinds of elections, and this fall we will be having both kinds of elections. The first is a primary election. This is an election in which the voters choose the candidates that they want to be on the ballot for the general election. So with the primary, the winner gets to continue and be on the next election ballot. With this primary election, voters who are registered to a political party have to vote with that political party on that ballot. So people who are registered as Republican will only be provided a Republican ballot. Democrat voters will get a Democrat ballot. In Rhode Island, if a person is unaffiliated, they get to choose which party primary they want to vote in. And once they vote for one party or the other, they will be considered to be affiliated with that party. And if the person wants to become unaffiliated again, they have to take action, which involves a forum with your local board of canvassers. Next slide. The general election is when we choose the people, the leaders, to have the job. So here with the general election, the winner gets the job. And with the general election, voters can vote for any candidate that they want, regardless of political party. So someone could vote for a Democrat in one race, a Republican in another race, the Green Party in another race. So that's different from primaries. Thank you. Here are some important deadlines. The primary election in Rhode Island is September 13th. That is when voting will happen at the polls. Early voting happens in the 20 days before that date. The registration to vote in the primary is August 14th. The general election occurs on November 8th at the polls, and the deadline to register is October 9th. Next slide. Rhode Island has 3 ways to vote. A person can vote by mail. This requires the person to apply to vote by mail. You also have to return your ballot in an official mail ballot envelope by 8 p.m. on election day. A person can return the ballot to a drop box. There are drop boxes all around the state, or by mail. If you're getting close to the election, you might want to consider Dropbox so that you are sure your vote will be counted. As I said, this does require that the person request with an application and comply with deadlines. This is people sometimes hear the term absentee voting, and what we have in Rhode Island is we call it mail ballot voting. Next slide. Another way to vote is early voting. Anyone can vote in person at city or town hall in the 20 days leading up to election day. There are a few larger cities that will have their early voting in different locations other than city and town hall. So I encourage anyone who wants to vote by early voting to call and confirm the hours, confirm the location. And if you have a physical disability, make sure you understand where the accessible entrance is. With early voting, a photo ID is required. And the third way to vote is to vote at the polls on election day. Again, here, photo ID is required. Next slide. There are some great resources on the Secretary of State's website to learn more about these ways to vote that I've linked up to here. Next slide. I've mentioned photo ID. At the polls and early voting, a person is required to bring a current and a valid photo ID. In Rhode Island, that is defined as an ID that has not been expired for more than 6 months. So if your ID expires right before the election, you should be okay. Another thing to note is that the Secretary of State's office provides free photo ID if a voter does not have any of the accepted IDs for voting. Next slide. So the kinds of photo ID that will comply with the requirement. It's not a long list, so you've got to have either a Rhode Island driver's license, a US passport, an ID card used by an educational institution, US military ID, an ID issued by the US government or state of Rhode Island. A RIPTA bus pass works. A government issued medical card, a voter ID issued by the Secretary of State's office, or a tribal ID. Next slide. So we've gotten through registering to vote and knowing the different, who can vote, the ways to vote. Now we talk a little bit about how to mark a ballot. It's important to review the instructions. Notice how many choices that you have for each race. For example, when you're voting for president, you only get to choose one person. In local races, however, if you look at school committee, you often are allowed to vote for more than one person. So it's important to know how many choices you're allowed to make. And in Rhode Island, there's a little oval shape next to each candidate. You fill in that oval next to the candidate that you want to vote for. There's also an option that's called the write-in option. And what that means is that if you don't like the choices you were provided, you can write in your own choice, and you still need to fill in the oval next to the write-in option in order to vote for that person. Next slide. You will see for a general election that there will be candidates to vote for on the front of the ballot, and often on the back of the ballot, there are state and local questions. These questions are often about how to spend money, like are we going to build schools or roads? Leading up to an election, you'll probably see signs that say, vote yes on question 1. When you are voting, you will not see the choice yes for voting for question 1. The language they use on a ballot is to approve or reject the questions. So if you approve and you are in favor of the question, you want to vote for it. You would fill in the oval next to the word approve. And if you are not in favor of the question, you would fill in the oval next to the word reject if you're not in favor and you want to vote against it. Next slide. Sample ballots are, a sample ballot shows the voter what will be on their ballot for election day. Sample ballots are available for people to review, usually about 30 days before an election. And reviewing a sample ballot is a great way to prepare for voting. Next slide. You can obtain a sample ballot by contacting your local board of canvassers, or you can find it on the Secretary of State's website. There's a section called Find a Polling Place and View a Sample Ballot. Next slide. Where do I vote? So if you're not sure where your polling place is, to find out the location of your polling place or early voting or a drop box, you can contact Disability Rights Rhode Island. We can help you with all of those things. You can also contact the Secretary of State's office, or you can look on the Secretary of State's website. They provide you the information about your polling place when you look up your voter registration status. And they also have a map of all the drop boxes around the state. Next slide. Sometimes when I look at a sample ballot, I realize that I have some education for myself. And so I always like to talk with people about preparing to vote, things to do to prepare to vote. Leading up to elections, you want to decide how you're going to vote, by mail, early voting, or at the polls. And make sure you know what the deadlines are so that you can meet them. If you need to plan for transportation or to get your mail ballot delivered, you want to think about that. A voter who needs an assistant will want to coordinate with their assistant. Voters should think about locating and obtaining their photo ID, make sure that it's valid, and review that sample ballot, because you might realize that you do have some research that you want to do. Next slide. Choosing candidates and issues. We encourage you to research the candidates and the issues. Ways to do that are to watch debates, read the news, look online. Some decisions that you might want to make about choosing leaders would be to choose leaders who have ideas that you agree with, values that are important to you, and experience to do a good job. You could spend a fair amount of time just doing research on how to research the candidates. I do have a link here to a blog from the League of Women Voters that talks about how to judge a candidate, which may be useful for you. Next slide. Mistakes. Sometimes people ask me, what do I do if I make a mistake on my ballot? If a voter makes a mistake marking the ballot, they can request a new ballot. Sometimes people make mistakes and they don't realize that. This could happen if a person marks too many candidates, or maybe they marked one and they make an extra stray mark that looks like it's marked an extra candidate. In this case, the voter will put their ballot into the counting machine, and the machine will make a sound and indicate that the person has overvoted. And then if this happens, the voter has a choice to take the ballot back and get a new one. The old one would be voided out and saved. Or the voter can tell the elections folks that they just want the ballot to go into the counter, and then the race where they overvoted will not be counted because there's no clear winner. Next slide. Again, I want to remind everyone about our hotline and hope that you will be letting others know about it. You can call us with questions about voting rights, registration, problems, assistance with getting an ID, or if you would like to know more about how to vote from hospitals and facilities. Next slide. This is a resource that talks about the laws relating to people with disabilities and their voting rights. Next slide. I have linked to some resources on polling place access. Next slide. Some national resources. A National Disability Rights Network is the organization that provides support to agencies like mine. And the Bazelon Center for Mental Health has a great guide for voters with mental disabilities. They update this every 4 years, so the 2020 version is the most recent and is very helpful and interesting. Next slide. The American Bar Association Voting and Cognitive Impairments section, there's a lot of information here that is useful. And again, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network also has some interesting resources for voters. Next slide. Here we have local resources, including my organization, Common Cause Rhode Island, the Secretary of State's office, and the Board of Elections. Next slide. We're winding down here, so I hope that folks understand that there's a reason to vote. We have impact when we vote. It's how we make our voices heard, and that with voting we are empowering ourselves and choosing leaders who will hopefully make policies and laws that improve our lives. Next slide. I wanted to thank you very much for having me. I've tried to wind down in case there are some questions, but I do want to emphasize that we have a mailing list. I hope you will go to our website and get on our email list. We're not going to email you every day, but I will be sending out reminders, several reminders throughout the election season about deadlines that are coming up. And I hope you will also visit our website and provide some feedback for this presentation. So this is all the content that I have for you today. And if there are questions, I am open for any questions that may be out there.
The only one here is Charlie Feldman. There was another person.
Okay. So not hearing any questions. You think we should wind it up, Jeremiah?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again for having me. And please call us if you have questions or voting needs.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Bye.